Okay, so yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Knight. I'm the Executive Director of ELLMA. Happy Friday, happy May Day, happy International Workers' Day. We hope you're all doing well. We're gonna get started in a moment. If you're just coming on, please use the chat to let us know who you are, where you teach, and I'm gonna have the rest of our panelists introduce themselves. Lizzie?
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Lizzie Humphries, and I am the high school history specialist. I'll pass it to Michelle.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Ferrari. I am a 7th grade history teacher at Edna Brewer Middle School. Kelly.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Kenneth Chin. I'm the coordinator of instructional technology. Nice to see you.
Okay. So we're going to jump right in. We're excited to host this webinar on documenting our world in a global pandemic. Just a moment here. Okay. So this is really about how we can explore creating authentic and meaningful experiences that recognize the historical significance of the moment we are living in and use it to lift up student voice. So, you know, I have a 9th grader daughter who said when shelter in place was first ordered, the first thing she said is, "I can't believe we're living in a global pandemic. We're all primary sources." So, you know, our youth really understands the significance of this moment, and I think are hungry to have the opportunity to think critically about this moment, to make meaning of it, to kind of process everything that is scary and disturbing and significant about what's happening. So today we're going to talk about a case study project and also think about what does it mean to support our language learners, our ELLs and our ALLs, so our English language learners and our academic language learners, to really fully engage in this type of learning. If you're just joining us, welcome. Please use the chat to introduce yourself so we know who's in the room. What we're going to cover today, we're going to have a little quick discussion of what we mean by meaningful tasks. We're going to go deep in looking at the COVID-19 journal project, so a view from the classroom by our amazing guest teacher, Michelle Ferrari. And then Lizzie is going to talk a little bit about the historical thinking lens of that project. I'm going to talk about what does it mean to unpack this type of task for language demands and opportunities to support our language learners. And then Kelleth will share some resources on how to support our students in using tech tools for documenting their world. So we have a lot going on today and happy to have you. Many of you, when you're on, and often ask, can we have access to the slides? You can. So on the bottom of all of our slides, you will see this tiny URL, and it's here for you if you want to note it down quickly. And you will be able to access the slides. There are actually some additional resources we want to add, and we will be adding that after this session, so you can refer back to that. And it might be helpful to actually follow along if you want to open up the slide deck. So we are grounding ourselves in these two guiding questions. One, how do we help students see themselves as historians and documenters of their world in this historical moment? And two, how can this project and any project help our ELLs and our ALLs develop and apply new language for an authentic purpose? As we always do in the ELLMA office, we are grounded in these 5 essential practices for English language learner achievement. If you have access to the slides open, you can click on this slide for the actual essential practices. Today, we're really focusing on essential practice 1, access and rigor. And so here we're talking about engaging ELLs in meaningful tasks and using technology to provide them the supports they need. So at the foundation of a strong pedagogy are meaningful tasks, and this applies regardless of the context of learning, right? Strong pedagogy is strong pedagogy, and we're trying to figure out, well, what does it look like in this distance learning context? And as it relates to our language learners, we really want to ensure that our ELLs are engaged in this type of rigorous and meaningful learning, and their learning isn't reduced to remedial and skill-based practice or busy work. And while there is certainly a place for that skill development, we want to make sure that they are supported to apply their thinking, their content knowledge, and language in new and meaningful ways. So what do we mean by meaningful task? This is a resource that we found. The source is below. So we're talking about learners as active partners, learners engaged in learning by doing, in problem-solving tasks and active learning, and engaged in critical thinking during and after the activities, learning situated in real-world problems and authentic issues. This idea of cognitive apprenticeship, Lizzie is going to talk about a little bit later, and then of course assessment of learning aligned to the learning activities. So we are really excited to have Michelle here, who's going to give a real live case study of what it looks like to engage all students successfully in a meaningful task. So take it away, Michelle.
Thanks, Nicole and Lizzie, for asking me to be here today to share this project. Really props to Lizzie for when this moment arrived and we were sheltering in place and figuring out what distance learning meant. Lizzie provided us with a wealth of resources through a classroom, and this project is actually adapted from something from UC History Project and a particular teacher in Mount Diablo School District, Brian Shaw. So looked at that work and then just kind of tweaked it a little bit for my learners. And so the journal project, really the essential question is, how do we connect to the larger world in this moment? So as a journaling project, we asked them to share their own authentic experience, reminding them that they serve as a primary source. As Nicole mentioned, her daughter was excited about, and many of our own students are, and teachers your heart starts to flutter when you hear students using academic language like that and thinking of themselves as primary sources. So that was really exciting. Give them that opportunity to be authentic, honest, and reflective about what they're experiencing. This ties into kind of some of the earlier phase work of looking at the SEL piece and how this is a moment in history, but it's scary and anxiety provoking for a lot of them. So really a process to be able to document and observe what they themselves and their family are experiencing, their neighborhood and community, and then the larger world as we look at this pandemic. Reminding them that in journaling as a historian, all the different levels that you look at this as, and also more importantly, providing an example for all learners. Really, they all benefit from it, but particularly the ELLs. We gave them an abbreviated list of questions. There are actually more in the original journal project, but we really pulled these out to take a look at to make sense of, again, on that kind of looking at their own microcosm and building out to the macro level of what's happening in the world. So each of the slides, we ask them to look at specifically how are they feeling, what's happening in my home, what's happening in my neighborhood, what do I have, what do I need more of, and then how does that compare when I look at the news and see what's happening in other parts of California and the world. And then once they created a slide deck of 4 journal entries, we asked them to have 1 slide of reflection. So this was just the 5th slide, so it was a 5-slide project, and to really look at these 3 essential reflection questions. So why was this practice of journaling at this moment important to you? And then to shift to how is your experience the same or different? So the real reflection on what's happening for me, and when I look outside, how does this compare to other folks in the world? And you know, take 12 and 13-year-olds, since this is a 7th grade audience I worked with, it's really nice to be able to see them, see themselves in a larger world. And then to really anchor into the historical thinking skills of looking at this artifact, 40 years from now, what conclusions could a historian draw, and what other sources might they need to corroborate with to determine if this is a reliable source or not. So getting into some academic language and historical thinking skills with that third question. And then this is just a neat, nice, concise little checklist for all of them to make sure that when they look at the final rubric, can I check all my boxes? Have I done everything that I need to do to successfully complete this project? And just a little reminder at the bottom too about what a paragraph is. Then my teacher example. So just referring back and forth to, you can go to the next slide. I think it's really important to provide this scaffold and use the language that we asked for earlier on with the observational insights, with that checklist of what we hoped to see in each one of the slides. So we asked for there to be kind of a personal experience, which you see on this slide for me, as well as how I connected it to the larger world, with the language highlighted for California leaders, urging us, and so on and so forth. So the format of the slide and the visual prompts really giving the students an opportunity to share. And as their teacher, because so much of our work has really been around making sure our kids have what they need and are doing okay, this is a really insightful project that gave them the opportunity to authentically experience this, but also for me to get a little sneak peek into what's happening at home, how they're feeling. And then this also gave us, time as a family of teachers to look at, are there particular students who need more at this time? So it served that purpose for us as well. And then I take them through 4 days. So I didn't just do one example slide, so I could vary the language and vary the different types of questions that I respond to each one of the slides, providing the overall format. And then lastly, getting to the 5th slide, which is where I do my reflection questions. And so showing them the question and then my individual response, and then modeling the more sophisticated question of number 3 of looking at it through like a historian lens. And then we provided them with a grading rubric, and we talked a lot about this rubric. This rubric's probably a little bit more basic than our typical rubric would be for an assignment, but I think this assignment we did a couple weeks ago, which is when we as a district were in the throes of talking about credit, no credit, assignments, all of that. So this really felt like we wanted to honor the work as a really important process for the kids to process what they're feeling and emotionally connect to it, as well as the historical piece. So again, this ties back to that slide with the checklists of the required elements, formatting, and creativity. But with the creativity in particular, we kept in mind access to technology. And so we kept real open communication with students about technology that they had access to and some of the limitations. Like, for example, some students expressed the inability to import images or do things like that were on a certain level because of the format they were working with. And so we did not penalize students who that was an issue for. So really the rubric was a kind of a soft rubric in that sense. Again, the project was to really engage the students with this historical moment. And the student work, this is the fun stuff. So I think we chose, these are all examples that you'll have the opportunity to look at your leisure, but 2 that we chose to look at are Xavier's work. So we'll take a look at that one first. Xavier did a really great job of lifting up in a really clear way his own personal experience, obviously some creativity too. And so his personal experience with a really, really detailed juxtaposition to what's happening in the world and what he's hearing about through the news. And so he got the chance to share a little bit about what online learning looks like at home, his fantastic, exquisite raspberry turnover recipes. So he obviously, this was a really fun practice for him, and I got a real good sense of what's happening at home. I see him using, and I just wanted to say, I see him using a lot of the language that I used in my examples, or from the observational insight list of questions. So then we have a second student example that used a differentiated template that we provided for students. And Sebastian's work. So the only difference really is that we made sure that that observational checklist with all the questions was really drawn into a template for each slide. And so on each one of his slides, you can see that he has this format of his journal entry, and the title are structured the same for every slide, and the same questions. Did you see anything today that gave you hope, anxiety, or fear? And then you'll see all of his responses are structured with what I heard, and in my neighborhood, and I feel hope, and then what I wonder about the larger world. And some amazing insights from him on this. Quarantine is boring, yes. We agree. And then here was my hope, was that this project, so when we set off to do this, when we all got told we were shifting to distance learning, this was not something that came right out of the gate. And I forgot to mention this earlier, I apologize, but there were a couple of assignments that we gave them that gave them a little bit of a historical context. So an assignment that gave some history to other pandemics throughout time. So they did some wondering around that, some learning, looking at reliability of sources early on before we questioned their own as a primary source. And then we did some analyzing of looking at the map, the interactive map that Johns Hopkins had put out, and we had students do a discussion board to look at actual real-time infections and deaths and parts of the world and things like that, and to connect it to geography. And then we felt like, okay, so we've given them some context, and again, remembering SEL, and that some of the students, this might be really anxiety provoking, that we kind of softened it a little, and we started to look for what were the positive signs of communities coming together. So we did a Newsella reading and got a little bit lighter. And so that was all kind of the framework before we launched into this journaling assignment. And then we got heavy again after this and started to look at different communities and how they've been impacted, and how our work as historians is to really kind of lift up and be witness to that. So my hope, these next two slides, this one here is not something, these other ideas, this is not something that I got the opportunity to actually do yet, but I really hoped that they might be something that interested someone else in the scope of what your content and teaching has looked like, particularly the oral storytelling. Is a really exciting opportunity for the students to create a podcast. This is a structure that we use at Brewer for our history night. We have the students have an opportunity to make podcasts. And so I just supplanted the language, instead of it being more general around our history night theme, to be more specific to this moment and to the pandemic. So there's really clear-cut directions here if you chose to do a podcast with your students on this historical moment.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm going to turn it over to you, Lizzie, in just a moment. I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that in many of these projects, we can also be thinking about authentic audiences. So we have a partner who would be willing to actually work with the students or small groups in a class if a teacher wanted to work on a podcast. And she would post it on her forum. And so, you know, there's multiple places where students could potentially submit work, and just thinking about how, you know, it's just both so motivating and also really helps students think more carefully about their presentation and the language they're using if they know that they actually have an authentic audience. So if that is something of interest to you, you can email me or any of us directly. Our contact information is at the end. But I'll turn it over to Lizzie for the next part.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. Yeah, before I talk about historical thinking in this assignment, I just wanted to pause and ask a question that got posed in the chat, which is, did you have any students without devices or internet? And I think another way we might frame that question is like, what would be some low or no tech options for asking students to complete an assignment like this? So I'll pose that to Michelle, but anybody else could answer too.
Yeah, so something that I don't know that I think we're all grappling with is we kind of put these things out there for students and we're getting like a certain participation rate. And so this felt like one of those assignments that had a high completion rate. So I think students who had access to the technology on any level were really excited to do this work. So there was that piece. In terms of, we did make a really concentrated effort at our site to make sure that we delivered Chromebooks to and got internet connection for students. So most of our students did have access to tech. I did have a couple students who were working with like phones and things of that nature. And so I had, I think, 2 students who did something on paper and took pictures and shared that with me, which would be kind of the on the fly, I guess, way from distance learning that they could share, or they could do it. Yeah, I think that was the only other means of them doing it that I experienced.
Awesome. There's another question about how we might modify this assignment for elementary students. And I just want to point out later on in a later slide, we have a link to a document that lists multiple versions of this assignment, including one that is tailored for elementary students. So I'll make sure I point that out when we get to that slide later. Okay. And I think that's all the questions that we have for right now. So I'm just going to jump into this next part, and you can continue adding questions in the chat and we'll address them towards the end of the webinar. So we just wanted to circle back to this list of characteristics that Nicole pointed out earlier around what makes a task meaningful. And first of all, I just want to thank Michelle for sharing this assignment, which I think is so rich and really hits on so many of these characteristics. And we wanted to name also that we're putting out this particular assignment as an example, but there's a lot of other ways that we could craft tasks that are also meaningful and that would also hit a lot of these criteria. So some things that I just wanted to lift up about this particular assignment or journaling assignment are the ways that it really requires students to be active partners. Like literally the content for this assignment is completely based on students' knowledge and experience. And then what students are asked to do is to critically reflect on that experience, to process it, both intellectually and also emotionally. It's the ultimate real world context. And I think that's really responsive and engaging in this particular moment where we know students really are wrestling with a lot of questions and a lot of anxiety about what's happening in the world. And then I wanted to focus in on one particular aspect of this assignment that, as a historical thinker myself, as a history specialist, I think is very exciting. And that's this idea of cognitive apprenticeship. So Nicole, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So this idea of cognitive apprenticeship really just means, how are we as teachers supporting students to do the same type of thinking that an expert in our discipline might do? So in this case, I'm coming from the perspective of someone who thinks a lot about history, the discipline of history. So on this slide, you see 6 concepts that we think of as really core to the discipline of history. That's these 6 here: historical significance, evidence, continuity and change, cause and consequence, historical perspectives, and the ethical dimension. I just want to point out, if you're interested in learning more about these concepts, there's a link down here, it's highlighted, to our ELA and history handbook, and there's a ton more information about each of these concepts in there. And Michelle has designed her assignment in a way that really hits on a lot of these concepts already. So the assignment itself puts students in the position of creating historical evidence and also thinking about what does it mean to create evidence that is accurate and reliable, and how might a future historian look back at the evidence that they're creating and think about how they're going to compare it or corroborate it with other evidence. What's the difference between looking at their journal as a primary source versus looking at, say, like a news article or other forms of secondary sources. So we saw actually in the responses that students were producing for Michelle's assignment that they're already producing really sophisticated thinking about historical evidence, which I think is very exciting. This assignment is also designed to get students thinking about the idea of continuity and change. So Michelle was particularly prompting students to think about the changes that they're noticing, both on a very small individual scale and also on a larger scale. And then finally, we see in that second reflection question that she asked at the end, she's asking students to think about how their individual experience might be different from the experience of others in other parts of the United States or around the world, which is really getting at this idea of historical perspectives, right? We don't all experience the same event in the same way, which is one reason why it's so important to consider sources that come from multiple perspectives. So there's a ton that's already baked into the fabric of this assignment that really gets students thinking about these historical thinking concepts. I think we lost our slides, but
sorry, y'all. I got kicked off.
Oh, hey, Nicole.
I am jumping right back. So sorry.
Thank you.
This never happened to any of you, right?
Never.
Yeah. Real world problems.
My internet works great.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. So I did just want to point out, since we're here really thinking from the lens of how we support our English language learners and also just any of our academic language learners, that I see really amazing opportunities for fortifying language in an assignment like this. And that historical thinking actually offers some really great opportunities for us to hone in on specific language. So Nicole, if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to give an example. So again, I'm coming back to some materials that you can find in our ELA and history handbook, which is again linked at the bottom here. When you go in there, what you will find is that for any of the 6 concepts that I mentioned, for example, continuity and change, which I think is really well reflected in Michelle's assignment, you will find sample content language objectives. And each of these sample content language objectives has examples of language that you might teach students explicitly that would help them express sophisticated thinking about that particular concept. So if we wanted to beef up the way students are talking about continuity and change, we might teach them, say, some adjectives to describe different types of change. Like, was the change explosive, like it all happened at once? Was it gradual? Was it drawn out? Was it abrupt? And each of these might be words that they could infuse into their journaling to help them really elaborate on what they're seeing. We might also teach them words. Actually saw this in some of Michelle's journaling, or how are we describing some of the continuity that we're seeing or the events that are happening simultaneously, like using words like as or well or during or simultaneously. Or we might get creative and we might actually ask students to express their thinking about change in the form of metaphor. And there's some examples here on this, this screenshotted page from our ELA and history handbook. So if you were interested in really focusing on historical thinking, there's some really great language teaching opportunities that could benefit both our English language learners and our academic language learners. And if you go to the next slide, Nicole. I also just wanted to point out, here's where you find that link to the many versions of this assignment that have been created by teachers throughout our region. That's this link here where it says COVID-19 journaling assignment page. These have been compiled by our UC Berkeley History Social Science project. Housed at UC Berkeley, it's our local subject matter project. And one of these versions that I think is really cool, if you're interested in focusing on historical thinking, is a version that is screenshotted here on this slide. And this version actually has prompts that have been created that are tailored to each of those 6 historical thinking concepts. So you could actually pull some of these prompts and then pair them with some of the language that you find in our ELA and history handbook to both support students' historical thinking and their language development. Okay, and I think I'm handing it over to Nicole on that note.
Okay, thank you, Lizzie. Sorry about that little leap on my part. All right, so for the next few minutes, I want to turn fully to the question of how we can support our English language learners and our academic language learners, again, our ELLs and our ALLs. So specifically, how do we attend to what we call the language demands of a task so that our language learners are fully supported to access the task and meaningful learning, but then also how are we attending to the language opportunities so that we see the content that we're providing as an opportunity to build language. And Lizzie just spoke really well to an example of how to use historical thinking skills in that way. So I'm going to be talking through these 4 planning steps that we have found in ELLMA to help teachers create language-rich content and instruction. And I'll be repeating this a couple times. You know, what we suggest is that you really take each step and think about fully, but then it really becomes a part of how you teach and what you do. And when Michelle and I connected this morning, she was like, I had no idea I did all of these things because it's kind of second nature. So you may find that some of these practices are what you do, and you may find particularly these last 2 that are outlined in red are more of a challenge or a new practice, right? And that's because in our pre-service programs, we're not provided training to really interrogate language and then to know what do you do with that to create experiences and provide strategies that help teach language alongside content. So we're just going to touch on this at a high level by going through each step and then thinking about, well, how would I apply it to Michelle's task? But of course, this is a process that would work with any task or any project. So step 1 is ensuring the task requires productive language. And when we talk about productive language, we mean speaking and or writing. So even if you are doing a project-based, Michelle could have done this project of like, it's a visual diary and there's not necessarily any language that goes with it, right? Or a math-focused task. We want to think about what are the opportunities that students have to explain their thinking, right? So many times we have tasks that are more focused on reading and listening, which we call interpretive, and that's important, but we want to make sure that the task also requires productive skills, again, speaking and writing. And the why of this is that the most effective way for our ELLs and our ALLs to develop language is by using it in meaningful and contextualized ways, right? If you've ever, anyone in the room has been a language learner, you know that if you don't use it, you lose it. And that's also true for ELLs. They're going to learn language by given opportunities and being required, right, to stretch their language and use it in new ways. That's one. Step 1. And in Michelle's task, we see, again, she already did this. I've written down or noted some other possible ways, including the low to no tech ways that students could be using written language as well as spoken tasks in this type of project. So step 2 is to write out a full or partial, what we call expected student response. And so what we mean by that is actually to write out what you hope students will say or write in this task. This can also be to also serve as a mentor or example text for students to clarify expectations. So why would we ask teachers to engage in this step? And it is because the language that we use as academic language speakers, right, we're college educated, the language that we use is often invisible to us. We don't realize what we're using or saying, or the language demands that we're asking our students to engage with. So this is an important stage of planning so that we can see the language that then we want our students to use. And in Michelle's task, she does this already by providing that teacher example. So we can look at her teacher example, and we can also look at the really strong entries from student work to serve this purpose. And we'll go through what that looks like in the next step, which is step 3. So that is then to take what are the language demands of the task that we're putting in front of students. And you can use that expected student response to analyze for what we call 3 levels of language. I'm going to go through that in just a moment. And what you'll want to do after surfacing the language is select a few language features that are key to the task and will really benefit students in the long term. The why. So we're going to talk about the 3 levels of language, and the most important thing that we harp on a little bit is that language is more than vocabulary words. And so by looking at these 3 levels of language, we'll be more prepared to be responsive to our students' language needs. And then by selecting a few language features, we can't teach everything at once, right? So we can focus in on, well, what is the language objective that I'm really going to focus on in my instruction, and then hold my students accountable to. So a little bit before we go back to Michelle's example of the 3 levels of language, we talk about words, phrase and sentence, and structure, right? Many of us think about vocabulary. This is a great link that I recommend. It's tiered vocabulary that's aligned to the Common Core. So it has that tier 2 general academic words, that cross content, as well as the most important tier 3 or subject specific words for a variety of contexts. So that you can find in that link. In the phrase and sentence, there's a variety of things you might think of in terms of sentence structure, but we're going to talk here for a moment about this idea of connectives and functional language. So by connectives, we mean language or words that connect ideas within and between sentences. And many of these connectives are also functional in nature. And by functional, we mean they are communicating or signaling a kind of thinking. So for example, like these ideas here, contrasting ideas, sequencing ideas, or cause and effect. And so we want to ask ourselves what type of thinking we want students to engage in and explicitly teach the related language, right? Again, similar to what Lizzie pointed out in the historical thinking skills. And there are a number of, this is a really great article around why connectives are so important to think about incorporating in our teaching across all content areas. And this, I won't click on this right now, but it's a chart that has by content area some resources to think about what does functional language specific to different content areas look like, and where are some resources to learn more about that. Finally, beyond the word and the phrase and sentence, we want to think about, well, what is all that language for? What is the overall purpose and structure of the language? And that's when we get into genre. I'll click in briefly. These genre cheat sheets that were made by WestEd provide examples of how, this first example of how an argument might typically be organized. And so many of us are familiar with thinking through what are the parts of an argument, how do I help students think about that. What you might not have seen or thought about as deeply is what are the specific language features that need to be included in a really strong argument. So these cheat sheets just give examples of how language can roll up to the structure level, and how those specific language features are going to help students be more effective within that particular genre or organizing principle. And so you see some examples of what we mean by the types of, the podcast. If it's a podcast, you're going to structure in a certain way, but it's going to drive the type of language you use, maybe a combination of more informal language and anecdotes with formal informational language. So all of that is a part of what we mean by language. And so how would we apply this to Michelle's task? I've done this for a while. I think about language a lot. And so this is pretty second nature to me, but it does take a little bit of practice. So I just took one of Michelle's journal entries and color coded it and just, what did I notice? So I see how in yellow, there's language that is referring to the picture, and we are seeing language such as this photo shows, this routine. We also see, if you wanted to get, a little bit more wonky into the grammar piece, but this is super hard for kids. We have these super long, what we call noun phrases. It takes the place of a simple subject. And so our English language learners don't necessarily know how to do this. This isn't natural to them. They need explicit instruction. So that's just something to think about. And then, of course, as I mentioned, connective. So we see here a connective that is a cause and effect function. And then in bold, we see some specific vocabulary. So what I do when I'm thinking about the task and look at the expected student response is briefly look at, what are some of those language pieces, and then choose what things might I want to point out and explicitly go over with some of my students or all of my students. And so looking at the whole of this project, if I were to think about language and think about a range of language learners, including some of our emerging English language learners, those at the beginning level, even our newcomers, I might think about language that's really important for them to have explicit exposure to. And so here's some words I might point out. Here's descriptive sensory language. There's some links to word banks that provide that for you. You may be thinking about, we always want to think about what are the verb tenses that are used for our beginning ELLs and newcomers. And so here we have a lot of progressive tenses. I am doing, I am cooking, I have been walking, I have been noticing. So specifically pointing out and perhaps providing them support with that. And again, we talked about connectives. And then just recognizing, okay, what is the genre? It's multimedia. The text and visuals really support each other, and we're asking students to kind of use a combination, right, of reflective and explanatory writing. So all of that is going to inform my thinking about how I support students, which is our step 4. What are those instructional implications to address the language demands and opportunities? And I'm thinking about 3 main things in terms of my instruction. I'm thinking, how do I scaffold? What language resources am I providing my students so they are successful? And then how am I giving, particularly my emerging and developing English language learners, some additional practice before they have to apply to a new content area? So one of the, using student talk, right? Hearing from colleagues, practicing that language before taking to writing. Practicing new language with familiar content before they apply it to more academic content is really key. And the why of this, again, is, it's hard work and it takes some additional time in our practice, in our planning process, but this is really what we need to, the thinking process and our planning that we need to engage in ourselves as teachers to support our ELLs and our ALLs to fully access rigorous and meaningful tasks, and to think about how all content and all tasks do provide an opportunity for our students to develop language. So if I were thinking about Michelle's task, she does so many things already. I may, in addition to that, think about if I have struggling ELLs, struggling ALLs, or English language learners who are just country and newer to the language, I may want to pull a small group Zoom meeting if I can get them on Zoom, and spend some time deconstructing the teacher example, maybe focusing on one of those language features. Maybe it's focusing on her connectives, and then providing some oral practice. So if I were focused on cause and effect, I may have some visuals and 2 simple sentences like, I dropped an egg, the egg broke. what are all the ways we can use as a result, so, because, therefore, right, to put those two sentences together and do some practice. I may also use some sentence starters that also have some emotion words for students, like I am tired because, I am tired so, I am tired and. So it gets some practice with those, using new emotion vocabulary for them, increasing the academic level vocabulary, and then helping them to see how that little connective word will lead them to a completely different response in that second part of the sentence. And then that will prepare them then to be able to apply and be more prepared to use those that more academic vocabulary and language to this academic content. So those are just some ideas. You saw that in Michelle's tasks, she already had differentiated slides. It was just so great to see her task and see how so many of these things were already kind of checked off. And then here, this link you can click on to see our actual planning document, which I'll also show what it looks like in a template. We have this very simple, step 1, 2, 3, 4 with some links embedded in this planning form that you can click on here and see the example of how I analyzed Michelle's task and see how you might use this planning form yourself. So I know that was a lot of information, but we hope that you are, are you taking my screen, Kelleth? Or was that an accident?
I still see your screen, Nicole.
We see your screen.
Yeah,
okay.
We can see your screen.
Oh, great. Okay, I can't see my, you can see the slide deck?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what happened. That's great. So, so we are, again, our contact information for ELLMA is available if you are interested in having, office hours or a small group kind of Zoom meeting to walk through this process, to think about language. We would love to do that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelleth.
Okay, well, first of all, just want to say I love this project and I love the way that it merges different disciplines, and it's really a great project for right now. So one of the things that when I was first looking at this project, one of my concerns is just that because it uses Google Slides, and not all teachers, not all students might not know how to use Google Slides. So just prepared a little bit of material just to help you and your students get started. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask Nicole to click on some of these links, but I just want to start out by saying that it basically kind of breaks down into two. This is the way that you can do the projects. You can break it down into two basic steps. The first one being that you create a template slideshow for your students, and then the second step being that you would assign the slideshow template slideshow to your students. So on the left here under step 1, it says create a template for students. So just want to let you know, so if you click on either that image or that first blank Google Slides template, that will create a copy for you, okay? Or it will prompt you to create a copy. So if you do that, then it'll just make your own copy. Otherwise, you would just be looking at a view-only copy, okay? So if you go back to that, and you click under there, under click just to view. So let's take a look at what this template looks like. And so this is a very basic template that really anyone can use, and you should be thinking about modifying it for your own purposes. So you would want to go back and look at the resources that are in this slideshow for today's presentation, just to make sure that it matches for you and that you're hitting a lot of the points that we've been talking about. And in this template here, this is something that you can modify for your own purposes. You can change the questions. And then it also includes right at the front, there's a Google Slides tutorial for students. So if you click on that, if you don't mind clicking on that, Nicole, it can be enlarged, but it also... Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about Google Slides, and we'll give you a quick tutorial for working on a slideshow. So we've got this plain slideshow here, and it is very plain. So we'd like to give it a little more personality maybe. So we'll click on theme up at the top. And that gives you a window that shows you all these different looks or themes that you can choose from. You can just click on any of them to try them out. So we'll click on this orange one, see how that looks. And you don't have to worry about getting stuck with one of them. Just click on another one. I'm going to go with this blue one and then close that window there. So that gets that out of the way. Then we can start working on the different slides. Now, I'll change your name to put my name, and you would put your own name in there. And then you can just click on the different thumbnails to see the different slides. I'll change the date in this one to whatever date that you're doing the entry, and then you can answer the question down below. So you just click into that, and you might need to click return, and then you can type your answer. Now I'm going to go ahead and type in my answer, and I'm speeding this up just to save us a little bit of time so we don't need to wait for me to type.
We could go ahead and we can pause that, Nicole.
Remember, you don't have to worry about.
So that's a about 5 or 6 minute tutorial for students, and maybe even for yourself if you need a little bit of an intro to Google Slides. And again, you can go into the template, you can change the questions how you like them. I recommend keeping it just like kind of that basic look, and then they can change their themes. But it does go that video goes over how they can add images if they want to. It also goes over how to change the fonts and the colors and whatnot. And that's something that's fun, that makes this personal for students. And just to mention also, Google Slides does have an app, a mobile app that works really well actually on iPhones and Android smartphones. So that is an option if students do not have regular internet connection with Chromebooks. Okay. And then over on the right, once you have your template ready and you're ready to share that with students, you can share that in Google Classroom. So just want to go over that just quickly. So if you don't mind, Nicole, just clicking on that there, and then we can make that a little bit bigger. So this is just a really basic intro there. You go to create assignment, then you can give that assignment a title. And then when you go down to add below, then you have the option to go into your Google Drive. And if you've already opened up that slideshow and modified it for yourself, you should see it in your recent files there. You can add that, and then you've got it there. And then this is the key over here on the right. You don't want students just to be able to view the file. You want to make a copy for each student. So this will make an editable copy for each student, and then you can assign it. So those are just the basics of how you get started. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to either myself or Sam Solomon. You can go to Teacher Central, and we do have contact information if you need any help with that. So thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. Lizzie, we're about at time, but is there any kind of comment or question that you want to pose to close us out?
No, what I can do, I have a document where I've been tracking the questions that have come up and the responses. So we can share that afterwards. And if people have additional questions, they can feel free to add to that, add additional questions. Maybe I'll just chat it out right now, just in case there are questions that we should address beyond the time here. Do that right now.
Okay. So we want to honor everyone's time and allow you to enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a wonderful weekend. Just close with this slide that has contact information of folks from the ELLMA team you can reach out to, as well as our panelists here. So we appreciate everything you all do for our students every day and would love the opportunity to support you. Any of our panelists want to say anything else before we close?
I'll just say, Michelle had to pop out a little bit early to be with her students, but I just wanted to add another appreciation to her for sharing this assignment. And she says that she's sorry she couldn't stay till the end, but if you have questions, she'll be looking at that Q&A doc.
And thank you to all of you for participating today. We know that this is hard,
Really appreciate your persistence and flexibility and your dedication to your students.
All right, and that's a wrap. Thank you all.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.